I am calling from the Muskogee land. A quick visual description of me is I am white, Ashkenazi, and mixed, most likely mostly British Isles. I have glasses and a dark brown beard and hair. And my background is Julia's background as well, which is the Centering Palestine logo and the Palestinian flag. Okay, so we're going to talk about the ICJ response and next steps. We'll also touch base briefly on the hearings in the case against Biden, Austin, and Blinken as well. And then we'll touch base on the UN RWA news. Okay, so what is it that South Africa asked for, slash, what did the ICJ give? So the links that you have in the session packet are to the actual documents as well of what South Africa submitted and then what the ICJ responded with. So, the big thing was South Africa, asked that the ICJ take on the case, that they rule that they have apparent jurisdiction to take on the case. And the ICJ agreed that they did have apparent jurisdiction to investigate. So the ICJ rejected Israel's request to dismiss the case. And South Africa had a few asked for provisional measures. And the ICJ agreed with South Africa that there is urgency and provisional measures are needed. The big disappointment that you've probably heard is the ICJ did not specifically call for an immediate ceasefire, which was one of South Africa's asks. And so then related to a call for a ceasefire, South Africa had asked that Israel, basically control the military to hold a ceasefire because the ICJ did not call for an immediate ceasefire. They did not call for Israel to control the military to hold a ceasefire. South Africa, asked that Israel act to prevent genocide. The ICJ addresses that more specifically in terms of the general ask that South Africa had. The ICJ did not address necessarily the general ask, but they did address it more specifically, so it is addressed. South Africa had some specific wording around, this is some of the more specific asks. So South Africa had some specific wording around desisting from the commission of any and all acts within the Genocide Convention. And the ICJ said, Israel must do this. South Africa laid out a few specific aspects of genocide and specifically referenced, forced displacement, deprivation of access to adequate food, water, humanitarian assistance, fuel, shelter, clothes, hygiene, sanitation, medical supplies, assistance. The ICJ responded that Israel must take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So it's good that the ICJ said that Israel had to address humanitarian aid and the adverse conditions. I think the ICJ could have been more specific in this part of their response, as South Africa was in their request. So South Africa asked that Israel control their military and irregular armed units or individuals from committing genocidal acts, planning genocide, incitement to genocide, complicity in genocide, and punish violators. ICJ responded, Israel must take all measures to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide. So, they're hitting the general notes. They could have been more specific, but they are hitting the general notes. South Africa asked that Israel preserve evidence. The ICJ agreed. South Africa then requested that Israel report within 1 week of the ICJ response and at regular intervals until compliance on the case is decided. And so the ICJ said Israel must submit a report to the court and all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month. So they did call for reporting. That's good. They did give more time than South Africa requested, and they didn't set a schedule of regular reports until the case concludes. The amount of time given has been criticized because time is of the essence and more lives are lost the longer this goes on. And, you know, if they didn't think 1 week was realistic, I think they could have proposed 2 weeks instead. So that's that. And then South Africa asked that Israel not extend the ICJ investigation. The ICJ did not actually include a specific provisional measure about not extending the matter. And I have no idea why they didn't say anything about that in the provisional measure section. Okay, so there are a few different views on how to view the ICJ decision. So, you know, some people are thinking, you know, in terms of like, oh, you know, is this mental gymnastics to find hope? Or, you know, is this basically self-congratulatory inaction? And so I do really want to acknowledge that many people are frustrated and heartbroken that the ICJ did not call for a ceasefire. That is very, very real and valid. South Africa's foreign minister and a few others have also said that the measures that the ICJ did order cannot be implemented without a ceasefire. So this may mean the court's stance on a ceasefire is firmer than what some may think, or it may mean that they're less committed to the measures that they did grant. And so while some people, you know, I have to call myself out on this, while some people feel elated that the ICJ did take the case and granted several provisional measures, the whole ICJ process, that a ceasefire hasn't been called for, and that the US and continental European countries are enabling what is happening is a travesty that is costing lives. And so Mitrovica, balancing these two contrasting interpretations, wrote an op-ed where he says that it's a victory at the cost of Palestinian lives. And that's linked, that's in the session packet. You can read that. So maybe this is mental gymnastics to find hope, but I do wonder if perhaps the ICJ did not call for a ceasefire because Russia blew off the ICJ on their Ukraine ruling. And I can't actually really take credit for thinking what happened with Russia might be a factor here because it wasn't explicitly stated, but the inference was pretty strong in that Al Jazeera article, which is actually linked to here. And then I guess, you know, another factor into this too could be that it's the most powerful countries behind the Gaza ceasefire. And perhaps the ICJ felt they would ultimately be more effective by accepting most of South Africa's interim measures, which might require a ceasefire to implement, while not calling for a ceasefire. Okay, but then let's see, looking into possible reasons for hope. In terms of the votes, I do think it's significant to look at the margins and the countries on those votes. That's actually going to be our next slide here. The ICJ response, the written response as well, does quote reports about the extent of harming Gaza and statements that suggest genocidal intent. So they might actually be, you know, more critical of what is going on than you might think. And I think another reason for hope that I want to find is that the ICJ response can open up more opportunities for advocacy and next steps. Okay, so then unpacking the ICJ's votes in terms of numbers and countries. So calling for humanitarian aid and addressing incitement to genocide, provisional measures that passed 16-1. The only judge voting against these was Judge Sebuntindi from Uganda. All other granted provisional measures also passed by a vote of 15-2, with only Judge Sibotinde and Judge Barak, so from Uganda and Israel, voting against them. The judges from China and Russia voted in agreement with South Africa. That's expected, but still worth noting because of geopolitics. Judges from the US, France, Australia, Germany, India, Japan, and Slovakia voted in agreement with South Africa. These are noteworthy because these are countries that have explicitly indicated siding with Israel and or because of geopolitics. The ICJ response did not include vote numbers for requested measures they did not grant. So I feel hopeful that the measures, the margins on the measures that the ICJ accepted were really wide. I actually did not expect the Israeli judge or the US judge to vote for any measures or to say that the ICJ has jurisdiction. And I thought the European judges would also vote against more of the interim measures. The fact that even the Israeli judge voted for some measures and the relative unanimity of the US judge and European judges voting for so many of the measures, I want to think says a lot about how this issue is understood and the power of activism, as well as perhaps the judge's ability to see how not accepting South Africa's case and issuing several interim measures, could irreparably harm an international commitment to a rules-based order, which could escalate war. So, it may also have been very strategic on the part of the judges. But still, I thought any outcome would come down to a very slim majority. So I actually do feel a bit stunned when I saw the actual vote numbers. And in terms of not reporting on measures not granted, I'm not sure if this means they did not vote on them or if it's not protocol to report on requested measures not granted. I want to believe that maybe they came to a consensus on what would be most effective in the circumstance, but I don't really know. Also, just FYI, before I go on to the next slide, Judge Sibutinde has actually come under criticism from Uganda for her votes, some officials from Uganda have been saying that her vote does not represent Uganda. So that's interesting, just to note. Okay, so then what are the next steps for the ICJ, the UN, South Africa, and Israel? So Israel has to submit a report on how it's addressing the emergency measures by February 26th, exactly a month after the ICJ responded. South Africa can then respond to that report. The ICJ will review Israel's report and what is happening in Gaza. They will decide if Israel is following the measures and can issue new ones at that time as well. And after handling the report, the ICJ will have more hearings and discussions of South Africa's and Israel's arguments that were presented in January. The majority ruling will be ICJ's final ruling, but that may not be issued for several years, just as a heads up. And just to note, the ICJ does not have an enforcement mechanism itself, but the UN Security Council can vote for Israel to follow the ICJ measures. If the Security Council does so, they can then take action against Israel for violations. This could take an economic form, such as sanctions or embargoes, though the UN Charter itself does allow the Security Council to authorize force, though that probably is not likely to be granted by the Security Council. The UN Security Council is actually meeting Wednesday, tomorrow, to review the ICJ's decision, and that is actually after Algeria called for it to meet. Algeria is expected to propose a ceasefire. Um, and I think it's worth noting that now that the ICJ has responded, the US faces new pressures on the Security Council. If the US continues to shield Israel from accountability on the Security Council with a veto, it does risk irrevocably damaging trust in a rules-based international order at this point. And while the US may not be likely to vote to accept the ICJ ruling in a Security Council meeting, not vetoing such a vote would still be huge. And so then Friday was a really big day. So I do also just want to touch base on hearings in the case against Biden, Austin, and Blinken. So Friday morning, the ICJ responded to South Africa. And then later on Friday, there are hearings in the case that the Center for Constitutional Rights is bringing against Biden, Austin, and Blinken. And they are bringing this on behalf of Defense of Children, Al-Haq, and then also individual Gazans and Palestinian Americans with relatives in Gaza. So CCR, the Center for Constitutional Rights, is charging that the defendants have violated international law requirements and thus federal law to prevent genocide. They are focusing on arming Israel as a violation of the Genocide Convention, and also are asking the US to influence Israel to stop genocide. The defense lawyers argued that the court lacks authority to judge the case because the matter falls under the executive branch and cannot be ruled upon by other branches of government. The case is considered a long shot in and of itself, but it may have a role in framing narrative. The case should be seen as part of a suite of Okay, so now we're going to go a little bit more into the actions of the US, Israel, and allies since the ICJ response. So I'm putting a content warning on this. We are going to be discussing genocide, bullying or power over, gaslighting, global instability, and international famine, starvation, and disease. If you have children nearby, please put in headphones or ask them to leave for the next few minutes. So also a heads up, the next 6 slides will appear blank because the text in them is white due to the content warning. If you are looking at these slides from our session packet and wish to see this content, please select the text box and change the text to a color that you can see. I'll be reading the content of these slides, and a slide indicating the end of the content warning will follow. So if you wish to mute to not hear these next few minutes, please do so now. Okay. So on Friday, Israel said 12 United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, employees were involved in the October 7th attack. Currently, 3,000 out of 13,000 core UNRWA staff in Gaza are still working. The UNRWA responded by dropping 9 of the accused employees. One is dead, and the identities of the 2 others are being confirmed. And they also launched an investigation. Some people believe Israel's allegations are politically motivated in order to distract away from the ICJ ruling, punish the UN for the ICJ's ruling, and further ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza. Al Jazeera noted that the UN agency has long been under attack from Israel and quoted a former UNRWA spokesperson who commented that the agency is under a coordinated political attack and that Israel sees disbanding UNRWA as part of its Gaza campaign. Reuters, too, noted that Israel has charged UNRWA with supporting Hamas for years. These sentiments were also echoed by Peter Beinart in an opinion piece, who notes that Israel has had a campaign for many years now to try to essentially abolish UNRWA because UNRWA's existence represents a kind of embodiment of the fact that there are all these Palestinian refugees. UNRWA considers them refugees. Israel wants to abolish UNRWA because it wants to abolish the issue of Palestinian refugees and never have to deal with that question, so it can permanently foreclose the possibility that any Palestinians could ever return, right? And then Derek Davidson, also in an opinion piece, questioned the veracity of the accusations that Israel made based on reports from Palestinian prisoners, specifically due to the high incidence of torture in Israeli prisons. In response to Israel's accusations, several governments announced cessation of UNRWA funding. This began with the US on Friday, shortly after the news broke. Other governments who have announced pooling or discontinuing funding are Australia, Austria, Britain, Canada, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Romania, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The European Union may be pausing funding and has said it would not provide additional funds until the end of February. In response to an appeal to not drop funding from the UN Secretary General, Israel's UN ambassador asked all governments to stop funding UNRWA and said that the Secretary General proved once again the security of citizens of Israel is not really important for him. The sentiment expressed in this statement disparaging the Secretary General echoes previous such statements from Israel. The funding cuts block the majority of UNRWA funding. Unless other nations step in and can take up the slack, Israel, the US, and other Western allies will put this UN agency out of commission at a time when 2 million out of 2.3 million Gazans face starvation and dehydration and lack basic humanitarian needs. Ireland, Norway, and Spain have announced that they are not cutting UNRWA funding. Cutting UNRWA funding, particularly before an independent investigation has been done, may constitute Western resistance to the ICJ ruling. It may be designed to weaken or send a signal to the UN, particularly before the Security Council vote tomorrow. It may be testing to see how strongly other nations will react to flaunting the ICJ interim measures to allow aid to Gazans, and or it may indicate a shift from war with quote unquote traditional weapons to starvation, dehydration, and disease. At the end of the day, it is a genocidal act that furthers Netanyahu's call for quote unquote voluntary migration and stated goal of destroying Gaza. It makes Western allies even more complicit in genocide, and it undermines an international rules-based order. The Biden administration continues to appear to be increasingly concerned about Israeli aggression. On Sunday, NBC reported that Biden is considering using weapon sales as leverage to curb Israeli aggression. This may suggest an impact of the ICJ and public opinion. However, as noted, cutting aid to UNRWA may accomplish Israel's stated goals in Gaza through other means.